Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 3 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about the stateless nature of HTTP protocol, how a web form is processed, what is ViewState, and the role of ViewState in ASP.NET. Finally, we'll look at the primary difference between ASP.NET server controls and HTML controls. Web applications work on HTTP protocol. HTTP protocol is a stateless protocol, meaning it does not retain state between user requests. Let's understand what we mean by the stateless nature of HTTP protocol with an example. I have a simple web application here called ViewState demo, which has got this web form 1. And if you look at this, I have two controls on this web form, a text box and a button control. Let's flip to the code mode of this web form by right clicking and selecting view code. And if you look at the code, the first thing to notice here is that this web form 1 is actually a class. And along the same lines, on this web form we have got two controls, text box and button control. The declarations for these controls will be in the designer file. So if you flip to the designer file, you should see that there is a declaration for text box control and button control. And if I right click on the text box and say go to definition, look at this. This text box is also a class. So what we need to understand at this point of time is that a web form and all the controls that we usually place on that web form are technically classes, and we know that a class can have objects. With that in mind, let's move on. So what is this web form doing here? Now if you look at the code, it's a pretty simple code. All we have is at the level of class, in the scope of the class, we have this variable, integer variable clicks count, which is initialized to 0. And within the page load event of the web form, when the page loads in the web server memory, and if it's not a post back, in the sense if it is an initial GET request, we are setting the text property of the text box to 0. When I click the button, anytime a user clicks the button, what we are doing here, we're incrementing the clicks count value by 1 and assigning the incremented value to the text property of the text box 1 control, which means technically when we run the application and when I start clicking this button, every time I click the button, the value that is shown in the text box should be incremented by 1. So if I click once, 1 should be shown. If I click the second time, it should be incremented to 2 and that value should be shown here. Let's see if that's what happens when we actually run this application. Now to run this application, press Ctrl F5. When we do that, the web form loads up. And look at this. This is the initial GET request. So we first got the page. Okay. And then when I click the button, we are posting the page back. So this will be a post back request. So when I click the button one time, look at the value gets incremented to 1. I click the second time, I click the third time, fourth time. No matter how many times you click, it doesn't get incremented beyond 1. Let's explore the reasons of why. So if you look at the code, it's pretty simple. I mean, we have already looked at that. Okay, so the reason for why it's not getting incremented beyond 1 is because of the stateless nature of HTTP protocol. Web forms live only for a moment, meaning when we let's look at what actually happens when we made a request for this web form. Look at this. I have this browser. Let's copy that URL. Let's copy that URL. Let's make another page. Look at this. As soon as I type that URL into the browser and press enter, the request goes to the web server, and this is the GET request. We are not posting the web form back to the server. Instead, we are getting the web form. So it's a GET request. So when the request for web form 1 goes to the server, what's going to happen? Now we know that this web form technically is a class. So an instance of this web form gets created. So who is going to create the instance of this web form? Now keep in mind, when we build this solution, what's going to happen? The entire source code of this application will be compiled into intermediate language, and since this is a web application, the application's assembly is generated, which is nothing but a DLL. Since the project name here is ViewState demo, we will have an assembly for this web application with the same name, ViewState demo.dll. And to look at that, you can right click on that, go to open folder in Windows Explorer, and you should see within the bin directory the application's assembly. So when you request webform1, what's going to happen, this assembly gets loaded into the memory, which creates an instance of the requested web form, which in this case is webform1. And then we also know that whatever controls we have on the web form, they are also technically classes. So obviously when we request this web form, we know that on this web form we have this text box and button control. So an instance of this web form itself will be created, and an instance of text box and button controls will also be created. And if you look at the code, it will process this code. So what's going to happen after it creates the instance of this web form, it creates an instance of this variable clicks count and initializes that to 0. And since this is a GET request, the page load event will be fired. And within that we are saying, okay, if it's not a post back, we know it's not a post back, so it gets into this if block, initializes the text box control with that 0, and then this button click event will not be executed here because we didn't click the button. So it is the initial GET request, it's not a post back request. So button 1 underscore click will not be executed. And then finally what it does, after completing the processing of this code, it generates the HTML. Keep in mind, no matter what your application does, the client for a web application is a web browser, and web browsers can only understand HTML. They can't understand C#, Java, PHP. They can only understand HTML. So no matter what technology you have used to build your web application, the application has to generate HTML which the browser can understand. So after the complete processing, what's going to happen? It generates the required HTML to send it back to the client. And once it generates the HTML, it sends that back to the client who requested that. And what happens to the webform1 object and this variable and the text box and button control that it has created? Everything will be immediately destroyed. So the web form will not know anything about that webform1 it has, serviced. Okay, everything will be destroyed, and the HTML is sent to the client. Okay, now when the HTML is sent to the client, the user is looking at this. Okay, now at this point when the user is looking at this web form, the web server does not know anything about this web form. Okay, so now let's say I click this button. So when I click this button, what's going to happen? Another request for this web form is going to go back to the web server. This time, since I'm clicking the button, I'm actually submitting this web form or posting this web form back to the web server. So when I post this web form back to the server, what happens? Let's look at that. So when you post, again an instance of this webform1 and text box and button control and this variable gets created, and it is initialized to 0. This is a page gets loaded, page load event happens, and it's not, if not, is post back. This is a post back event, so this code will not be executed. And then we have clicked the button, we posted the page back by clicking the button, so button click event will also be executed. And at this point we are incrementing the value of clicks count by 1. So clicks count is 0, it increments that by 1, so 0 plus 1 is 1, and we are setting that 1 to the text property of text box 1 control. So at this point it generates the HTML, sends it back to the client, and it immediately destroys that web form again. Okay, so at this point we should see the value of 1. Now if I click it the second time, what happens? The request for the web form goes again to the web server. So another new instance of webform1, text box control, button control, and this clicks count variable will be created. And look at this. Every time you post this web form back, every time you request this web form, this value is initialized to 0, and within the button click event you are incrementing that by 1. So it always stays at 1 no matter how many times you clicked. And every time you request this web form, a new instance of that web form, controls, and any variables on that web form are recreated. The web server does not remember the state between requests. Okay, now to make web server remember the state, in ASP.NET we have a ViewState field that we can make use of. Let us see how to correct this problem using that ViewState field. So web form lives barely for a moment. When a request is received, an instance of the request web form is created, and along the same lines an instance of any controls and variables on that web form are created. Events are processed, generates the HTML and posts that back to the client, and the web form is immediately destroyed. So to correct this, I have a variation of code, and it's very simple again. Here clicks count is initialized to 1, and in the page load it's the same code. If not, is post back text, set the text property of text box control to 0. So if it is the initial get request, set the text to 0. And if it's the button click, in the sense if it's a post back event, what we are doing here, look at this check is very important. Now view state of clicks is the name of the variable. Okay, and this is a view state variable that we are using to store the clicks count. You can name this anything you want. I just chose to use clicks. So if view state of clicks not equal to null, what we are doing here, we are retrieving the value that is present in clicks, converting that to integer, and adding 1 to it. Now why do you need to do this conversion? Because technically in a view state variable you can store anything you want. Simple object, complex object, date, time, anything. Okay, and then look at what we are doing after that. We are incrementing the value of clicks by 1, and we are then converting that to string and assigning that to the text property of the text box control. And finally we are storing that clicks count back in the view state of clicks. Okay, so let's actually see with this code what's going to happen. I have actually typed this and kept it ready so that we don't have to waste time in typing it. So I have this web form 2. If you look at the design, it's exactly same to web form 1, except that in the code behind file, you see this code that you have just seen on the slide. So clicks count is initialized to 0. So when we first request this web form, let's close this. Or you can just simply type the URL of webform2 here. So when I type in webform2.aspx, press enter, we are making the get request for webform2. So that is this one, webform2.aspx. Okay, so when we make a get request for this webform2, what's going to happen? An instance of this webform2 get created, an instance of this variable gets created, which is initialized to 1 here, and then page load gets executed. It is not a post back event, so it comes into this block, and it initializes the text property of the text box 1 control to 0. And then it doesn't execute this button 1 click event because it's not a post back. It generates the HTML, sends it back to the client, destroys this web form immediately. Okay, and that's how we see this 0 here. And when I click it for the first time, look at what's going to happen. When I click it for the first time, okay, post back request goes to the web server. So an instance of this web form 2 gets created. Along the same lines, an instance of all the variables and controls on the web form. So clicks count gets initialized to 1. Page load event fires is not post back, so this is a post back, so it will not execute this code. Button 1 click event, it comes here. And look at this, is if view state of clicks not equal to null. Here view state of clicks will be null because we haven't stored anything in this clicks view state of clicks variable yet. So this will be null for the first time. So this piece of code will not be executed. So what we are doing here, we are saying clicks count dot to string. We are converting clicks count to to the string and setting that as the text property of the text box control. So clicks count is 1. So text of the text box is set to 1, and then we are storing that clicks count in this view state variable. Okay, so at this point the text is set to 1. So when we click the button, the value of this text box is set to 1. And it sends the HTML back to the web server and destroys that web form immediately. But remember, we have stored the clicks count in this view state variable. Now what's going to happen, the value is going to travel between the client and web server in the form of a hidden view state field. We'll explore that in a bit. Okay, now we know that in the view state the value at the minute is 1. In this view state of clicks, the value at the moment is 1. So now when I click this button for the second time, look at what's going to happen. The value gets properly incremented as expected to 2. And how is this happening? If I right click on this and say view page source, you should see a hidden field here. underscore view state, and it has some random characters. This is nothing but it is storing the value of that view state of clicks in a base 64 encoded format. Okay, so this view state field, this hidden view state field, gets transferred between the client and the server, between every request and response. Okay, so now for the second time when I click this button, what's going to happen? The value in the text box, whatever the value that was there in the text box, it's now stored in this view state of clicks variable. So that gets sent to the server, and within the server, actually if you look at the web form, there are several events at the level of the web form. You have page initialization, page load, page pre-render, etc., which we'll be talking about in a later session. But for now, understand that there is an event called page initialization, which occurs even before page load event. So during page initialization, view state restoration happens, meaning from that hidden underscore view state field, web server will base 64 decode that view state data and then populates it either to the variables or the controls. Now here we know that we have assigned this value clicks count to view state variable of clicks. So when I click the button for the second time, what's going to happen? An instance of this web form 2 gets created, clicks count variable gets created, which is initialized to 1, page load event fires. None of this code will be executed because it's a post back. It comes to the button click event, and it now checks, is view state of clicks not equal to null? Yes, it's not equal to null, because remember in the previous request we stored clicks count in that variable, and this field is shuttling between the web server and the client in the form of that hidden field. So now what's going to happen? It retrieves the value from that clicks, and we know that within clicks variable we have stored 1 in the previous request, and we are converting that to integer, incrementing that by 1, and then we are setting that clicks count to the text box, so it shows 2. And then finally, look at this step is important. You are storing that back in the view state variable again. So this get base 64 encoded and then send back with the response to the client, and then when the user submits the page, along with the request, the view state field also comes to the server, and on the web server during page initialization, the view state restoration happens, so that this variable will get that original value which was there and then increments it by 1. So this process repeats. So if you want to retain the state of variables used between requests, between postback requests, we can make use of this view state field. Okay, so because of this view state field, it gets incremented correctly as you expect. So click the button now and the value gets incremented every time we click. So how is this possible? It's possible because we are using the view state variable clicks to preserve the data between requests. The view state data travels with every request and response between the client and the web server. And how does it travel? Using that hidden field underscore view state, which is basically base 64 encoded. Now let's look at a slight variation of this example. Now if you look at this, it's a pretty simple example and it's exactly same, except that we have modified, we have got rid of that clicks count variable which was there, and if not is postback textbox1.text is equal to 0, we are initializing the text of the textbox1 control. And in the button click, look at this, what we are doing, we are getting the text that is present in the text box control, converting that to integer and adding 1 to it, and then finally storing that back as the text property of the textbox1 control. And let's see how this works. So I have this web form 3 here, and if you look at the design, it's pretty much the same thing. And if you look at the code, it's exactly what you have seen on the slide. So if not is postback, you are setting the text property of the text box control to 0, and upon the button click, what we are doing, we are taking the text out of the textbox1 control and incrementing that by 1 and assigning that value back to the text property. So now if what we have spoken until now is true, then this should not increment the value, because we know that every time you make a request for this web form, let's run this first. So I have this web form 3. I click this button once, okay, value gets incremented correctly. 2, 3, 4. Now look at this. I am not using any view state field here, but then my text box is retaining its value across postback. So how is this possible? If whatever we have spoken now is true, in the sense every request is treated like a new request, a web form gets created, all the controls on it get created, it shouldn't be incrementing that value, because look at technically what should happen. Now when we request this web form, it creates an instance of this web form 3. It creates an instance of the text box and button control on this web form, and then it initializes the text property to 0 and sends it back. So upon the initial get request, you will see a value of 0 within that text box. And now when you click the button, it's a new request. So a new instance of web form 3 should be created, text box should be created, and it's not a post back, it's a post back, so this will not be executed. And in the button click, actually textbox1.text, it will be an empty string, and you wouldn't be able to convert that to integer. But then here it properly detects there was 0 and it's incrementing to 1, and next time you click it, it gets incremented to 2, and it works. But how is it doing that? Because behind the scenes, all ASP.NET controls by default use this view state to preserve the data across postback. Okay, that's what is the advantage of using this ASP.NET server controls. They use this view state field to retain data across postback. And that's why every time you click this button, the value get properly incremented without we having to use explicitly the view state variables. So upon clicking the button, the value gets incremented correctly as expected. This is possible because textbox1 is an ASP.NET server control that uses ViewState internally to preserve data across postbacks. Because web forms have very short lifetimes, ASP.NET takes special steps to preserve the data entered in the controls on a web form. Data entered in controls is sent with each request and restored to controls in page initialization event. The data in these controls is then available in the page load or button click or page pre-render, any event that basically occurs after page initialization. We will be talking about the events in the page lifecycle of a web form in a later session. But understand that all ASP.NET controls, server controls behind the scenes use ViewState to preserve their state across postback. And finally, we'll look at the primary difference between an ASP.NET server control and HTML control. And to demonstrate that, I have another web form, and this is a very simple web form again. All I have done is I have typed in this text ASP.NET server control, and I have dragged and dropped this text box. Look at this. If you look at the toolbox, there are several sections within the toolbox. I have standard section, I have HTML section. Now this standard section shows all the standard ASP.NET server controls. So if you look at the text box that we have here, it's from the standard tab, this text box, which is an ASP.NET server control. And on the other hand, if you look at this, this is an HTML control. And where did I get this from? I got this from the HTML tab from the toolbox. So if you look at the HTML tab, I have this input text. This is a standard HTML control. Okay, so this is an ASP.NET server control. That's what the label says. And this is the standard HTML control. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this web form. So when we run this, I get web form 4, and all I'm going to do here is type something into it. Test. Look at this. I'm typing test word into both the controls, and when I click the button, look at what's going to happen. And in this button click event handler, we don't have anything. It simply posts the page back to the server. And look at this, the ASP.NET server control retains its state, but whereas the standard HTML control does not retain state. Why? Because ASP.NET server controls uses ViewState to retain their state across postback, but HTML controls does not do that. That's why they don't retain state. So that's one of the primary difference between standard ASP.NET server controls and HTML controls. Now, is it possible to convert an HTML control into an ASP.NET server control? Absolutely. All you have to do to convert an HTML control into a standard ASP.NET server control is to add this runAt is equal to server attribute. So if you go back to our web form 4, and if you look at the source of this web form, look at this. I have this text box whose ID is textbox1, and it has this attribute runAt is equal to server. This is the standard ASP.NET Server control. Whereas this input ID is equal to button1, text is equal to, oh, this is the button control. So input ID is equal to text1, type is equal to text. This is the standard HTML control that we have. And if I want to convert this into a standard ASP.NET Server control, all I need to do is add this runAt is equal to server attribute, and you're done. So now flip to the design mode. Let's run this once again. So now let's type the same thing, test, into both of the controls and click the button, and let's see what happens. Now if you look at this, both these controls are retaining state. So if you want to convert an HTML control into standard ASP.NET control, you can add a runAt is equal to server attribute. Now, as I told you, ViewState data is serialized into base64 encoded string and is stored in hidden input field, and that is something like this. Actually, this is wrong. This is event validation. You should say, if we run this, if I right click on that, let's type in something into it, test. How are these controls retaining their state? Because they are using this input type is equal to hidden, name is equal to, look at this, the name of the hidden input field is underscore ViewState, and this is a base64 encoded string. And this gets base64 decoded in the page initialization event on the web server, and it populates that data back into these two controls, so that the data in these controls will then be available in the page load or page pre-render or any event for that matter which occurs after page initialization. Okay, so we have a slight error in this slide. Maybe by mistake I used the underscore event validation field. It's not event validation field, it's underscore ViewState field, the one that you have just seen here. So this is the field that makes use of ViewState. So just ignore this here. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.